is a wrapped asset real? It's as real as your ability to redeem it.
Really, to fix this, we just need a way to bridge faster.
So yeah, I think that's essentially what Espresso is building. A lot of times people are like, what does Espresso actually do? And what do you think is the future of wrap tokens?
From Alysia and Ellie Davidson, welcome to Composable, a podcast that takes you deep into the tech behind Web3's building blocks.
Every episode, we dive into one key question about how crypto works today and the design space for how it might look in the future.
Composable is an Espresso pod, a production of Espresso Systems. All opinions expressed by Composable's hosts and podcast guests are solely their own views. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be taken as investment, legal, or technical advice.
Today, we're going to be talking about, are wrapped tokens even real?
Yeah, let's jump into it.
All right, so maybe let's talk about what is a wrapped token versus a canonical token. So what is a canonical token?
For sure. So a canonical token is a token that you create with an ERC20 standard, for example. Let's say deployed on Ethereum, but it's canonical because it's created by a particular issuer. So if you created the Ellie token, then you are the owner of the Ellie token. And if I ever want to use the Ellie token, I should look up for the one that you created. So if I decide to launch an Ellie token, that would not be the canonical token because that's not the real token. That's not the original token. I think that's how I'll describe it. What about you?
No, yeah, I completely agree with that. I think a really good example is USDC, where, Circle is the company that issues that. And if someone tried to issue another token called the USDC, like, it's not the real USDC.
Yeah, but you definitely would have interacted with other versions of USDCs that protocols would have treated as something that contains value. So let's say, for example, you were to bridge USDC from one platform to another, you may not actually interact with the canonical token or the canonical USDC on the destination chain. You might have interacted with the bridged USDC, which an application would associate with the regular USDC, but it's not the canonical USDC.
Yeah.
Because
it's a wrapped token.
It's a wrapped token.
So yeah, a wrapped token is when you take some token and you kind of wrap it into your own token. And when you do that, you say, okay, I promise that the real token actually backs this wrapped token. And you have to kind of take my word for it. So an example of this would be when you're bridging from like USDC from Ethereum to some rollup. There has to be some amount of USDC that's locked on Ethereum, and then they will mint USDC on that rollup. But the USDC that they mint is not actually the real USDC because it's not Circle that's minting it. So basically, you're trusting them that they actually do have the real USDC locking behind this on Ethereum. But anyway, yeah, that's a wrapped token. They're very, very common in bridging and rollups. A lot of times you probably may have interacted with a wrapped token and not actually realized that that's what it was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think an example of that is if you were to use Aave, for example. Let's say you have USDC and you want to deposit it into Aave because you want to generate yield from lending.
Yeah.
You deposit it, and Aave actually gives you a token called like Aave USDC, which is a wrapped token because you have locked your original USDC into the Aave platform, and then the original token is no longer accessible to you. But then they give you this wrapped version of the token, almost like a receipt, IOU. And whenever you do want to redeem this token, you can then go to Aave platform, present them the wrap token, and they're like, oh yeah, true, you really did wrap this token with us. You really did lock your assets with us. And then you're able to redeem the underlying assets, which in this case is USDC. So when you think about wrapping a token, you're thinking you have given your assets that you hold and you sent it to a smart contract. That smart contract now contains ownership of these assets. And then they mint or issue you a new asset that is a wrapped token. And they give it whatever name makes sense, like for their platform or whatever you're doing.
Yeah. I think the key part is the reason we have to use wrapped tokens is because you don't always have minting rights to the tokens that you want to use. For example, I want to use native ETH in my application on Arbitrum. Well, I don't have permission to mint my own ETH on Arbitrum. So it's really like wrapped tokens really come down to who has the right to mint things.
Yeah. And yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, like why we see so many wrapped tokens, because there's so many versions of USDC. I think one first useful example of a wrapped token is wrapped Bitcoin. So Ethereum was created, cool. We have programmable smart contracts, cool. Then there was a DeFi boom. And with DeFi, you're able to generate yields on your assets. But Bitcoin is an entirely different network and it does not have smart contracts like Ethereum. So if I owned a bunch of Bitcoin, how am I able to participate in DeFi? Well, they created a wrapped Bitcoin
Yeah.
and you deposit it. You have this
Mhm.
wrapped Bitcoin, it's locked somewhere. You now receive this wrapped Bitcoin token, which is just an ERC20 token on Ethereum, and you're not able to participate in DeFi. So wrap tokens, there are pros, there are cons. We will touch on some of the cons, but I think what it has done for the ecosystem is increase interoperability. Whether it's because you want to use the assets in another protocol, like with liquid staking,
Yep.
you want to stake your ETH, but then you receive this liquid staked ETH that you can then do other things with, or if you actually want to do some cross-chain activity as well.
Yeah, exactly. And it's a good thing. Another note about wrapped tokens are you can do extra things with them too. Staking is a really good example with Lido. You get a wrapped ETH token when you stake with Lido, and it's worth the underlying ETH, but over time you also get rewards, and those are represented in that wrapped token. So you can kind of add extra, complexity and rewards using wrapped tokens. They're very flexible.
Yeah. And I think even with wrapped tokens, there are different types. So, for example, it could be wrapped by a centralized custodian. For example, I think BitGo is responsible for wrap BTC. It could be wrapped by a smart contract. It could even be wrapped by a bridge. So, because this is the composable part, of course, we're going to talk a lot about cross-chain experiences with wrapped and canonical tokens. But before we dive in, maybe we should share a take that you found on Twitter.
Yeah. So assets issued on the L2 or assets issued on L2 does not inherit L1 base layer security. Yeah, this is a hot topic. So we talked about wrapped tokens and how it's all about who has the right to mint them, right? So the argument here is that the layer one is really secure, but maybe you actually mint the canonical token on an L2. And that's where like the official ledger lives, not on Ethereum, even though the rollup settles to Ethereum. And so the question is, well, if you have that canonical token on the L2, like what does it mean when you bridge it to the L1? And what it means is that it's really only as secure as that L2, even though it's on the L1.
Yeah.
And this is it's a point of debate where people kind of talk about, should all assets be issued on the L1 originally due to its security, or is it okay to issue some canonical assets on L2s? I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And I think when you're creating an NFT project as well, you have similar thoughts. Like, do I create the original NFT project on Ethereum? And it's fair. Like, if you think about which bank you want to, like, have your assets locked up with, you think about the security. So I think with Ethereum versus L2, I can understand why someone might decide, you know what, like, I much prefer to deploy the first version of this contract on Ethereum because I know Ethereum is the longest standing chain when it comes to chains with smart contracts on them. So yeah, I do think there is value in saying like, yeah, let's use Ethereum because Ethereum has the most validators, the most distributed validator set, for example. L2s do get security from L1. So one can argue like, okay, well, it should be the same. But at the same time, from the time you have to go from one platform to another, you are now encountering different trust assumptions. You now have to think about how this L2 operates. Is there sequencer decentralized or other parts of the stack you've never heard about? Like who has keys to it? Like what happens if this part fails? So because there are more trust assumptions with using an L2, I do definitely agree. At least for me, if I were to create an Alysia token, I will create it on Ethereum first.
That makes sense. And maybe as a concrete example of what can go wrong when you issue the canonical token on an L2 is that anywhere you bridge that token to another L2 or the L1 is having to trust that L2 that they're minting correctly. So they're minting assets that are properly backed by some other asset. But the thing is, if that L2 decides to be malicious and just mint these tokens out of thin air, there's nothing that any of the other ecosystems can do. But they're all affected. So if you just mint money out of thin air, it ruins the value of that token. So even though the token is bridged to the L1, even though the rollup settles to the L1, there's nothing to prove, that there's actually assets behind it.
Yeah. I think a lot about on-chain activities being able to prove the activity. And one example of using something in L2 that you use in L1 and we treat as the same is ETH.
Yes, that's a good example.
Yeah. So ETH is used as a gas token on Ethereum. That makes sense. It's a native asset. Okay, cool. And then on L2s as well, they do use ETH as a native asset. And when you utilize ETH on these platforms, they do treat it as native ETH. But is it really?
Yeah. I would argue no, it's not. It's very close, but it's not, because ultimately the only thing that has power to mint ETH is the Ethereum L1, and that it's that protocol. So anytime, even like when you treat it as native ETH on these rollups, ultimately the rollup is minting something that they don't have the power to actually mint. So it is actually a form of a wrapped token, even though it doesn't have like wrapped in the name.
100%.
Mhm.
And even just ETH as like what ETH is native to the Ethereum protocol. It is not an ERC20 token. It is like embedded in the protocol. Whereas when you use ETH on Arbitrum, for example, it is an ERC20 token. So that alone just shows you like it's a different like artifact you're interacting with. And but the good thing is if you are a developer and you're trying to make a decision of, okay, so I am on Arbitrum, I would like to have users use ETH on my protocol, you definitely should use the native ETH, like what they call native ETH on Arbitrum, because that would be the standard ETH and that would be the one that you can say that most people would be trading and would have the most liquidity. Whereas if you use a bridge ETH, you can also do that, but I think it still makes more sense to use the native ETH for that protocol.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
What
are some cons?
Some cons
of wrapped tokens.
Wrapped tokens.
Yeah.
All right. So yeah, wrapped tokens, hugely popular, a lot of benefits. One of the cons is that they have really different security models. So it's really easy to understand the security model of ETH as an asset because like, oh, Ethereum mints it, easy.
Yeah.
With wrapped tokens, it's difficult to understand, is this wrapped token secured by a multi-sig? Is the contract it's in audited? Is this wrapped token the one I actually think it is? Because a lot of them are named very similar things. So I think it's way more difficult for developers to understand the security model. And I would say it's like unrealistic to expect users to understand it because it's just so all over the place.
Yeah, definitely. And I think from a developer perspective, if you are building an application and you would like to make use of ETH, for example, and there's so many different versions of ETH, and let's say you decided, you know what, like I really like this bridge, I'm going to use their version of bridged ETH. And then when you try to create some kind of composable application, like, okay, take this bridged ETH and then deposit it into Aave, then Aave is like, what the hell is this bridged ETH? Like, nah, like we don't accept that as collateral here. We accept the native ETH. So then you're limited in what you can build. And then that leads to fragmented liquidity because now you have all these assets that have value. It is bridge ETH, it does have value, but then you can't actually use it on another protocol. So it's just trapped within that system. And that's why people talk about like, fragmentation when you're doing things across chain. It's not just the fact that we have many different chains and many different apps. It's the fact that we have so many different tokens that are meant to represent the same one. Yeah. But they're different versions and they all have different trading pools. And who is supplying liquidity?
Yes. That's another con to a wrapped token is that you're not guaranteed. So in theory, you should always be able to get back the original asset. Yeah. But you're not guaranteed to be able to get it back if there's no one who's willing to like trade you liquidity for it.
Exactly.
And so this is another thing. You need to choose some sort of a wrapped token that you think will have enough liquidity that you can actually get your money back. It's all like it's very complicated. And all right, so this is all, wrapped tokens seem great, but they're so complicated. So like, is there an answer to fix this?
So what are we fixing? Like, what do you think needs to be fixed there? Are we fixing the fact that I need to wrap a token? Are we fixing the fact that I need to bridge across chain and I'm forced to wrap a token?
I think our problems would be pretty solved if we could bridge canonical tokens. Yeah. And did away with the wrapping.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess we should talk about like why exactly can't you always bridge canonical tokens? Okay. So let's say I would like to bridge from Ethereum to Arbitrum. I'm so sorry we keep talking about Arbitrum. Let's say Ethereum to Optimism, right? I would like to bridge, let's say USDC from Ethereum to Optimism. And let's say there is canonical USDC on Optimism as well. So that means Circle, they went ahead and deployed their contract on Optimism. So there's USDC there. Technically, from a bridge developer, I can say like, hey guys, I can guarantee you that this user locked their USDC on Ethereum. Can you please mint me the original USDC on Optimism? But in that case, you're essentially telling the Circle contract mint USDC. But as a bridge developer, you don't have permissions to mint on Circle's contract. That's their contract. Like they own that contract. So that's like where the problem starts. Like I don't have control over this asset's contract. So therefore I can't call functions like mint. So I have to find some other way to help this user get the assets across. So maybe what I decide to do is I'm like, okay, cool. I don't have access to Circle's contract. So I will create a contract called wrapped ETH. And I will promise you that whenever you do want to get your native ETH and you go back to Ethereum, you have this wrapped asset and you can prove to me that you have this asset. I will burn this asset on the chain that you had it minted on, and then you can redeem it on Ethereum. So that's one, I guess, obstacle a developer has to encounter when they're thinking about how do I bridge tokens across chain. And then their solution probably is, I'll create a wrapped
Yeah.
version of it.
And I guess it's also worth noting that, all right, so these like native ETH on rollups are actually wrapped tokens, but I guess they're a little bit different in that they're, in theory, should have a lot more security. So
Yeah.
I pretty much trust that ETH on Optimism and Arbitrum is going to be always redeemable for native ETH.
Yeah.
And I think that's a little bit of a separation between some of the other wrapped tokens. So I think what would be really great is if, we could just use the Arbitrum bridge for bridging our ETH really quickly. Because the reason that people don't use it today is because it's slow.
Yeah.
Even though it's like the canonical bridge. So
Yeah.
I think really to fix this, we just need a way to bridge faster.
Yeah, I agree. I think, okay, so like if you're a bridge developer, you're trying to think about how can I verify that this asset was locked on the source chain, and how can I ensure that the transaction is final so it will never reverse. And then of course I have to produce the asset on the destination chain.
Yeah.
So when it comes to verifying that the asset is locked, that should be easy enough. When it comes to making sure the transaction is not reversed, they have to wait for finality.
Yes.
And I'm sure you've been listening to this podcast and you heard our previous episodes, but if not, check out previous episodes where we do talk about things like finality and bridging. But essentially, different chains have different finality times. So Ethereum could be like around 12 to 15 minutes. And if you have to wait that time to bridge, then it does take some time because, I mean, the bridge developer wants to ensure that this transaction never reverts. So what are some ways to overcome finality?
Yes. So I'd say the main way is to try to get as close to finality as you can, but still within like a reasonable speed.
Okay.
So for example, you could say, the L1, it sometimes reorgs, but I don't think it's ever reorged more than like 10 blocks, if it's it's like hasn't happened in years.
Okay.
So maybe you say, okay, I'm just going to trust this bridge transaction as long as it's 10 blocks deep on the L1. And that works. It's not quite the same as Ethereum finality, but it's close. And you say, okay, this is close enough. Another thing you can do is have a confirmation layer, which is like a network of nodes running some sort of a consensus protocol, very, very similar to Ethereum. But their whole job is to just say, hey, I confirm that this thing is final and it will never reverse, etc. So
yeah,
I think those are kind of the two options.
Yeah, I think that makes sense too. I'll introduce a third option, which is a sequencer.
Oh, okay, yeah,
yeah.
That's a good option.
I mean, it's a good option just because like there are some sequencers that I would say are doing a good job of keeping up. They have not been hacked,
Yeah.
And like if you trust the sequencer confirmation, it's a soft confirmation, and it does mean that there could be a chance where that confirmation cannot be trusted for various reasons, like it's hacked or like the parent chain reorgs. So it's not the perfect solution, but it is probably a solution that some people use. But I think my favorite of those is what you mentioned, where it's secure, like you reduce the trust assumptions, but then try to get as fast as possible. So you're just pushing the boundaries of like how fast can I go, whilst making sure you don't have to add too many trust assumptions.
Yeah.
And we talk about that a lot.
Yeah, this is what we do at Espresso.
Yeah.
We talk about this all the time. Yeah,
that's me, Espresso. So yeah, I think that's essentially what Espresso is building. A lot of times people are like, what does Espresso actually do? And we make it so that the sequencer, like if it says like these are the batch of transactions that just happened, they have to definitely push that batch to the parent chain, and they cannot produce any other batch. And we confirm that. And once we provide that confirmation, it's a bit harder than the sequencer confirmation because the sequencer can change its mind eventually, and there's no one upholding it to that. Whereas when a chain is integrated with Espresso, they now have to make sure that they definitely always produce that batch to the parent chain, which is the same batch they're sending to their own chain.
Yeah.
So I don't know if we have like a really good term for it. Like we just say confirmation sometimes. We say Espresso confirmations, fast finality, fast confirmations, but it's just another layer where it's coming from a network, a Byzantine fault tolerant network. So you can increase, you can have like a higher trust in it compared to like just a centralized sequencer.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So yeah, I think like when you think about bridging solutions, again, we have an episode about that too. There are different solutions and they push the risk in different directions. So if you don't want any risk at all and you definitely want to receive a canonical asset on the end, definitely use a canonical bridge. Like I'm a canonical bridge girly, but it takes some time, right?
Yeah.
Like it takes like at least 15 minutes if you're bridging across chains. And then there are solver networks as well. So that's like across protocol, for example. But then as a user, you get a really great experience. It's super fast, but you're pushing the risk down to the solver. So the solver themselves still have to like think about how much risk they're willing to take.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. What do you know about like solver networks and how well their performance is? Do you have much experience with that?
Yeah, so solver networks can perform really well. A
Yeah.
lot of them do just trust a sequencer pre-confirmation.
Okay.
But they know the risk in that, and they say, hey, the risk is worth it because I give users a really good experience, and then that's what people will pay for. But
Right.
yeah, they do open themselves up to a lot of risk if that sequencer would ever not like get hacked. Not even if get hacked. Sometimes if the sequencer just crashed accidentally, you could also have a reorg. So yeah, they have to take on that risk.
Yeah. And I think I remember you were telling me one time that with solvers, they don't necessarily always allow you to bridge super large values across
Yes.
because they are taking on that risk.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so yeah, they don't want you to bridge super large values because it's risky for them, and also that means that they have to like have liquidity on these chains. So that's another thing is when you're using solvers, they're great, but the solver has to have liquidity on the destination chain, and like that costs them money. You know, they could be doing something else with that liquidity. Whereas if you just had like a canonical bridge where you didn't have to rely on liquidity on the destination side, you can bridge as much as you want and it doesn't matter.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. And I think if you're a developer and you want to build a cross-chain experience, you can normally a cross-chain experience means you're bridging like something of value. So like an asset to cross-chain. You can use something like cross-protocol to build on top of. I was reading their docs recently and it says something like, okay, if you create a transaction, let's say you want to bridge assets, if the solvers are not able to fulfill the transaction, you have to try again. So that, you know, you will find a way to work around that in your developer experience, but then you can also consider using like cross-chain messaging platforms, like Hyperlane and Layer 0. But even if you're building with those, you have to then think about these security models.
It always comes down to these security models. It's like, how do you choose which one? There's so many of them.
Yeah. So like you can think like, okay, like I will wait for sequencer confirmations and like you have you can like customize what end results you want depending on the application and how serious the transaction is, how much value is being transferred across. But I could imagine like combining those security models with something like Espresso confirmations where you want to get something that is customizable. You're not waiting for finality, but you probably don't want to trust sequencer confirmations because it's not 100%, you know, guarantee that everything will go through as it should. And you want to be able to transact large value.
Exactly.
Yeah.
All right. So I feel like we've talked about the good things of wrapped tokens and the cons. Where do you stand? Like, do you still think wrapped tokens are a positive thing for the space or no?
Okay. Wrapped tokens are definitely useful because there are many use cases, not just across chains, but also on the same chain. Like when I mentioned, people use it as a receipt if you lock an asset into a protocol. It's great for tracking. At least you're like, oh, where did my ETH go? Oh, yeah, I deposited into Aave. Like you have the receipt. So I think it's good for that. And technically, those tokens aren't meant for trading, even though people do trade them. But technically, it's not, you know, they're not meant to like fragment liquidity in that way. I think when it comes to cross-chain transactions, it just, I don't know, like you start thinking about like, how am I sure I can always redeem the original asset? And you start thinking about the trust assumptions. So my preference is to receive the canonical asset when I bridge. And I think in terms of is a wrapped asset real? It's as real as your ability to redeem it.
Yes. I love that.
Yeah. So like whether redeeming means unlocking it on the source chain or whether redeeming it means you're able to like trade it in a liquidity pool somewhere. Once you can redeem it, that's how real it is. But sometimes you can't really predict what will happen in the future. And that's the tricky part.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. What about you? What do you think?
Yeah, I feel very much the same way. I think there's a lot of value in using them as like reward tokens. Absolutely. I think it just gets like a little bit hairy when you're talking about bridging because bridging is just so hard because the risk is so much. Like if you accidentally end up minting something that you never burned on the source chain, like that can hurt every single person who holds that token. So it's like a very serious thing, I think. And I'd like to see just more canonical bridging made easier so people can just use canonical bridges.
I love that. That should be a series, canonical bridging made easier. Yeah, that's so true. And I think for me as well, like as a developer, like when I read these, you know, documentation for these protocols, I wish they would be a lot clearer about the trust assumptions and like what happens because I'm building an experience for a user. It should be easy for them. But we are transacting value. Like we have a high responsibility as a Web3 developer, right? So like we have to be sure that when they receive this value, nothing can go wrong. So yeah. What do you think is the future of wrapped tokens?
Yeah, I'll say the future I want. Maybe this isn't very realistic. I think the future is, yes, you use them for reward tokens completely, and you use them to represent canonical assets on a roll up. For example, you use like only Arbitrum is allowed to mint ETH on the Arbitrum roll up. I think that that's an okay version of a wrapped token because, I mean, like you can't get away from that. You have to represent it. But I would like to see wrapped tokens in terms of like other bridges, etc. All of that just go away. Yeah.
She's like disappear.
only the canonical tokens should be the only ever like wrapped tokens.
I agree with that. Everything's kind of new. Ethereum came out in 2015. We're still improving on this space. We're still, getting standards together. And now there are these like cross-chain token standards. So for example, Layer 0 has this omni-chain token standard. I like that. Like if you are creating a token for the first time, I think you should consider those because that would make it easier for cross-chain developers to then build cross-chain experiences with these tokens because we have so many blockchains and we accept that users may have a preference of one over the other. So therefore, there's a high chance that your application has to go cross-chain. So yeah, thinking about creating like a cross-chain token from the jump, if you can, I do think is like a feature that I predict.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah.
Very much. All right, so we've talked about wrapped tokens and we'd love to hear from you guys. Do you think wrapped tokens are real? At which point does a wrapped token become real to unreal?
Yeah. And I think if you've been listening to this, we're talking about bridging a lot, but if you'd like to learn more about bridging, then definitely check out our previous episode. We have one that's called Is Bridging Even Real? So we definitely love to hear your feedback on that one as well. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to follow us at Composable Pod. See you in the next one. Bye.
Hey, this is Ellie and Alysia. Thank you for joining us on another episode of Composable. We love hearing from you, so please hit us up on Twitter at ComposablePod, send us feedback, and join the conversation.
Our episodes go live every 2 weeks at 7 a.m. Eastern Time, so make sure you like and subscribe so you never miss an update, and you can even enjoy it with your morning coffee. Share it with your friends and fellow builders.
We'll see you next time on Composable.